Hey crafty friends, this is Chelsea. In today's video, I'm going to share my favorite hack for getting perfectly layered distress oxide ink backgrounds and not ending up with a muddy mess. I'm going to be making 3 cards today, but these techniques can be used for any type of project, including scrapbook layouts. I'm focusing on this beautiful set. It's the stamp of the month for July called the Bee's Knees from Close to My Heart. Each month there's a new featured set, and you can either buy it at full price, you can get it at a discount when you spend $60, or you can get it for free if you're a VIP and you place a $60 order. I will have all of that linked under this video for you. And for my Distress Oxide inks, I'll be using Mermaid, Lagoon, Kitsch, Flamingo, Mowed Lawn, Spiced Marmalade, Squeezed Lemonade, and Mustard Seed. But you could swap this out for any colors that you have. You could also use the regular Distress inks or any ink pads that you have that are reactive with water. I also wanted the option to bring in some metallics, so I have my starry colors here from Cardstock, their watercolor set. I will link those below as well. And then since I'm going to be working with water, I want my Archival black ink. Since it is safe to use with water, it's not going to run. And then some Distress watercolor cardstock. You could use whatever paper you like. I just like the way water reacts on this paper. But play with what you have. I like that this one has a smooth side and a textured side. Then of course I also have my stamp of the month here, which I'm using for most of the sentiments and the images. I'm also going to use this Dreammaker set for that text stamp. So you could use any kind of text background stamp that you have. And then I also have a hexagon stencil. This is an older retired one from Close to My Heart. You can see it is well loved. Now I'm bringing in my all-purpose mat. It's a great surface to work on. I love that it has a grippy side on the back so it stays in place, and then the slick side on the top, which makes a great surface for blending. Just set out my whole rainbow of colors here, and there's a piece of the watercolor paper cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I've grabbed a little baggie and a spray bottle with just plain water in it. And I'm adding both of those yellow colors, that was Squeezed Lemonade and Mustard Seed, and I'm just going to start smushing it down here. You can see that beautiful vivid color. I do like using a plastic bag sometimes for this technique because you can have pretty good control. You can kind of see what's happening a little bit easier. But I'm going to switch between bringing the packaging to my paper and also just putting ink directly on my mat and dipping into that as well. It kind of gives 2 different looks. So I started out with the yellows, the oranges, and the pinks, and I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more pink here because I felt like it kind of got lost and I wanted it to be a little bit stronger. Now I do like to start off with colors that all mix together well, right? Yellow, orange, and pink mix really well. I am also taking breaks to dry because when you dry a layer, it helps it retain those shapes. If you just keep adding water and adding water, it kind of all mixes together, gets all muddy, and you don't get those nice, distinct kind of splattery shapes. So now I'm mixing green and blue because those mix together well, and I'm filling in the other side of that panel. I am trying to kind of stay away from mixing the green and blue too much with the warmer colors, especially the orange, because orange doesn't really mix really great with green or blue. And by drying in between those layers, it does help to keep them separate and help them just kind of layer on top of each other instead of mixing while they're wet. Going back in and adding more orange because I felt like the orange was getting lost, and I wanted to make sure I had all of the colors represented there. Now I did cut out a little bit of the layering and drying. I just wanted to get enough to where I was happy with it, but I didn't want to show too much of that really long process. Now that panel is dry, and I am going over to my bee image from that stamp set. Using my archival ink, I like to do a test stamping first. I have a little foam pad underneath this scrap piece of printer paper just to help me get a good impression. And I'm just going to randomly stamp this around on this panel. So my idea is to die cut the center of this panel for the sentiment. So I'm kind of just building a background here. I want the pattern to kind of fill up the whole background, so I will need to bring in some smaller images to help do that. Now, if you don't like the contrast of the black against all those colors, you could also heat emboss this. I think that would look really pretty, either with a metallic or with white, and it would give it a little bit of a brighter look than with the black. But I really like the way the black looked. Now I'm grabbing that little honeycomb image. It has some florals on it. It's so cute. And I'm going to fill in a lot of the bigger areas with this one. There's also a smaller honeycomb image that has no florals on it. You can see that right here. And I'm going to fill in even more. I'm not worrying too much about the middle because I know that that's where I'm going to die cut from. But I am making sure to get right up to my edges and actually overlap my edges because that gives the feeling that the pattern continues on. Maybe even I cut this from a pattern paper down into a smaller piece. It just looks a little bit more natural. Now I'm grabbing one of these simple stitched brackets, and it's a smaller one. You could use any shape for this that fits your sentiment. And I just die cut it out of the middle, and I did cut down my panel just a little bit to put on the white card because I thought maybe a white border would look nice. It turned out to be quite a busy pattern panel, so I wanted to see what that would look like. I debated stamping my sentiment right on my card base, but I decided to cut another one of those brackets on white cardstock and then stamp in my black archival ink. I'm coming back to my background. I wanted to add some of that gold splatter, so I'm just getting that wet there. I love these watercolors. They do such a great job. I love how metallic and bold they are. So I'll hold that up here, and it looks a little bit more shiny once it is fully dry. This is while it's still wet, but I kept the splatters fairly small. And then I decided I needed some more white. You see on that right-hand side how there's that one lighter patch? I liked how that looked, and actually it made me want to bring in more brightness to the rest of the panel. So I pulled in my white gloss spray and just flicked that all around and brought back some white. I love how the gloss spray sits on the surface, and it will actually keep its white color. So now I have to let that dry. Now once that had dried, I decided I needed more of a white border. So I took the stitched rectangle frames and I actually cut it down. So you can see there's slightly that there's a stitched line. If you don't have these because they are retired, you don't have any kind of stitched rectangle die, you can just cut it down to a little bit smaller. This is 3 3/4 by 5, I believe. So it just gives it a little bit thicker white border, which I think balances all that bold color a little bit better. I did pop up that whole panel with some thin foam tape, and then I stuck the sentiment piece down flat to the card. Now on to the second card here. I have the Just Because stamped on a piece of the watercolor paper, as well as this beehive, which I hand trimmed out, and then another one of the stitched panels. All of those pieces except for the card base are on the Distress Watercolor cardstock on the smooth side, and the card base is one of the close to my heart bulk card bases and envelopes. I usually use those for all of my cards. Sometimes I forget to mention it, but that's usually my go-to. Now I'm going to use a water brush, and I'm using the squeezed lemonade, mustard seed, and the spiced marmalade to shade in this beehive. And I started out with the lightest yellow, and then I'm going to go into the darker yellow and then into the orange for the deepest shadows. I'm not really worrying too much about this. I'm not trying to make it perfect. I'm making it very painterly. I am going to darken the area next to where the flowers are because I figured that would have some shadow to it. And then also some of those lines on the hive, kind of where it's folded looking, I will add some of that orange as well just to darken it up. But have fun with it. Don't stress about it too much. All of these colors blend together really well, so it really won't matter too much, where you decide to put colors. You can kind of just go crazy with it. I mostly kept the orange towards the outsides and just kind of blending along some of those lines. And I did stamp this in the archival black and let that dry before I brought in the water. I am using a water brush, which means there's water in that barrel, and I'm just very lightly squeezing it out into my puddles of color there to water down, and some of the water does come out as you are coloring. You can use a regular paintbrush and just a little pot of water, or just spray out some water on your mat. Either way will work. You can see I've been kind of jumping between the colors, and this whole area is still wet, and that's one of the perks of using watercolor paper is your surface does stay wet longer, it can handle more water, and just leads to easier blending. If this is regular cardstock, it kind of soaks in and stays where you put it, whereas the watercolor paper will help it blend across the surface a little bit better, and you'll get smoother results. And you can see how that's pretty well blended, going wet into wet. Now, important part, I am drying it because I'm going to switch my color palette for doing the flowers. And I do not want those colors bleeding into the rest of my hive there. So I wanted to make sure that area was completely dry before adding water to this area. Especially on watercolor paper, wet attracts wet. So if I left the yellow area wet, it would just run right over into those colors, which could be a look if that's what you're going for, but that's not what I was going for. Now here, I don't care if my blue and pink mix together. That's totally fine with me. I wasn't being overly particular. I wanted to color this quickly. If some flowers are like half pink and half blue, totally fine. Doesn't hurt my feelings at all. I wanted it to be a little bit more painterly. If some of the leaves accidentally get colored in with a blue or a pink, not a problem. I do have a green there that I will work into some of the leaves, and we're just going with it. This video is a collaboration with my friend Julie, so she has made 3 cards using this set as well and using different techniques. So I will link her video at the end of this video and down in the description box as well, so make sure you go check it out so you can get even more ideas with this same set. And if you're enjoying this video so far, I hope you'll give it a thumbs up and let YouTube know that it's a good video and that they should share it with more people. It really helps my channel and I appreciate it. Now, if you've hung around this long and you are not really into coloring, whether it's watercoloring or anything else, don't worry, we are almost done the coloring portion. So remember I said I didn't worry about the coloring the center of the flowers or anything? That's because I'm going to use the metallics. I'm bringing in the metallic watercolors to fill in those centers. And if you mix it a little bit thicker, which means just using less water, it's opaque or fairly opaque, and it will cover up whatever color was underneath. And you'll just see the nice shine and sparkle from the watercolor, which is really nice. So now we're going to move on to the background. Now that we have our big focal image done, I'm grabbing the Mermaid Lagoon. We're going to add some water to it, and then we're just going to get that all mixed in with the water. I want it to be quite watered down, and then I'm grabbing my little plastic bag again and then just smushing away. So you get a little bit lighter application of ink this way. Rather than pushing it down into the mat, it's just a little bit lighter. And I'm going to dry that and then add some more splatter. Because by drying it, it retains that initial splattery pattern. So you press down, dry, and do that however many times you like until you're happy with the result. You don't have to worry about getting muddy colors when you're only doing one color like this, but you won't have that same definition, that same nice splattery look if you don't dry in between applications of the color. It will kind of just all blend out with the water. So now I've dried it. You can see we got some great texture going on back there, but I wasn't done. I could have been done right there. I think it would have looked fantastic, but I decided I wasn't done. I put down that hexagon stencil and I'm going to use the Mowed Lawn. And I'm going to start in that bottom corner with a heavier application of ink. And as I go towards the right-hand side, I want the inking to get lighter. So it's kind of darker to the left there, and then towards the right, just kind of faded out. I really do love layering with these Distress Oxide inks because they have that special formulation of being part dye ink and part pigment. They layer really well on top of each other, and you get those distinct colors. So I think I'm going to leave it right there for that part of the background. Now I'm bringing in that text stamp from the Dream Maker set. I'm using pewter ink. I'm stamping off and then stamping on my project just to get a little bit lighter gray. And I think we'll call that good for that part of the background. And of course, got to bring in some splatter. So bring out that gold paint again. And just to that top left, bottom right is where I'm going to add the gold splatter because that's where it will be seen. I went ahead and stamped more of those honeycomb shapes on just regular white cardstock, and I'm going to paint them in solid gold. Now you do have to thin down the gold a little bit with water, because otherwise if it's too thick, it'll be opaque or partially opaque and it will cover up some of your lines. So you kind of have to play with how much water to add so that you get the desired effect. I'm also using some of this darker gold color because I just wanted to switch it up so I didn't have all the same tone of gold. I love that this set has so many options between like champagne golds and, bright yellow golds, deeper golds, and it gives you a lot of flexibility to match the project that you're doing. Once those dried, I assembled my card. I did use some thin 3D foam tape under the rectangular panel and then under the beehive and under my sentiment. I do have a little 4-inch white doily. It's actually from Wilton. I got it from like the cake decorating section at Michael's. It's a perfect size to fit under there. And then I just kind of tucked all those little gold painted honeycombs under the sentiment. I love the reflection of that gold paint. Okay, on to our last card. We are going to be doing some stamping. So I have pulled out my Tim Holtz stamping platform. This technique really works best if you have some sort of stamp positioning tool, because we're going to repeat the stamping in the same position. And I'm going to start off with my biggest element, which is that bee. And I want to use several colors on here. So I love how these inks stand out on the stamps, and they actually stamp really well. You can get some really nicely stamped images with the Oxide inks, but I used the yellow, orange, and pink on here, so I kind of have an ombre going on this bee. And for this technique, I wanted a lot of ink on there, so I am going to re-ink. And it doesn't matter if it's not in the exact same place or these colors are mixing. I chose colors that all mix together really well. If you do get a little bit of transfer onto your ink pads, you can just grab like a paper towel or something and wipe off your ink pad. It's totally fine. It won't ruin it. So I stamped it twice in the same position. And then I'm going to take this out of my platform. I'm going to spray this with water and activate those inks. So you can see how it's just kind of pooling outwards. You can get some really fun effects with this. And you can decide how much water you want to add. If you want to just add a little bit of water or a ton of water, you'll get different looks depending also on what colors you're stamping with. Some colors actually bleed more than others, and some colors have different undertones, so you'll get different effects when you do it, but I love this technique. Now the trick is to keep your stamp in your platform. Once you dry that, I put it back in there, and now I'm stamping with the pewter ink. I decided rather than going really dark with black, I would use the gray ink and have it just a little bit lighter. I did end up stamping it twice, but you could definitely go with just once if you want it a bit lighter. And this looks really fun because then you have all those colors kind of bleeding out underneath of it. And depending on how much water you added will affect the final look. And if it looks like very blendy, very watery, or just a little bit, you could skip the darker outline if you wanted to, and have a more soft look to it. But I really like how it looks with that dark layer over top, giving you all those details. Now I did the same thing with the larger honeycomb and the smaller honeycomb. And now I'm just blotting off a little bit of that pool of water. I really got a lot of water on there. And I'm just repeating that same process. I'm drying in between so that I can stamp the gray ink over top. You don't want to stamp the gray into the wet puddle because it will kind of bleed everywhere and not look very pretty. So you definitely want to dry that first. And then I wanted a little bit more detail up in that corner. So I did add one more stamping with the floral honeycomb. I just didn't show that part because I had to reposition it and kind of go through all the steps again for that honeycomb. Now I'd lost a little bit of the pink, or didn't get quite as much pink. I found that Kitsch Flamingo did not run and bleed the same as the orange and the yellow. So I added a little bit more in just with my inking tool to bring in more pink. And then I lined up my sentiment. I'm going to put it right here in the center. And I'm doing that with black Archival ink. I don't always use my stamp platform for things like a sentiment, but I figured since I already had it out and I was already using it, that way I can double stamp it if I need to. and I did end up double stamping it. Now, like so many of my projects, I could have left it right there. Like, this is a very pretty panel. We got some nice blendy, watercolory looks, and this could be good enough, right? Add maybe a little bit of sparkle to it and call it done. But I did not stop. Like I usually don't. So I decided I wanted to add some more of those hexagons, which is totally fine, but I forgot one thing. I forgot to dry my sentiment. So I did this right after I had stamped that, and right as I'm going over top of that sentiment, I'm like, oh, right, I forgot to dry that. I got a little smudgy. Not too bad, but just a little smudgy, and you can definitely see it there. But at this point, I was not starting over from zero. So I just added a little bit of those hexagons with the squeezed lemonade, and then I'm adding more of that gold splatter with the watercolor. It kind of ties it into the rest of my cards with that gold splatter. And here is the finished card. I popped it up on some regular thickness foam tape, and you can see it has that nice little twinkle. You got all that kind of watercolor goodness, the hexagons. You can see it's a little smudgy over the word thinking and sweet, but I did wait for it to dry and then went over and added a little bit more yellow ink to try and save it so it wasn't too smudgy. But there are my cards. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you took away the best thing you can do when you're working with these inks is to work with inks that blend together well when they're wet, and to dry. Dry, dry, dry. Use that heat tool, dry between your layers, and I think you'll be much happier with the results. Make sure you check out Julie's video, and you can also check out my cards playlist here if you want to find more card ideas. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.